Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, by Gordon S. Wood, narrated by Joel Richards. A new science of politics is needed for a new world. Alexis de Tocqueville, 1835. Preface to the 1998 edition. If I did not know it 30 years ago when I wrote The Creation of the American Republic, I know it now, that books belong to their audience as much as, if not more than, to their authors. Back in the 1960s, I scarcely foresaw what many would do with my book over the succeeding decades. Like any young historian, I hoped my book would have some effect on the profession and on our understanding of constitution-making in the Revolutionary era. But I had little sense that I was participating in what Daniel Rogers has called a conceptual transformation in American history writing. Of course, I was dimly aware that a number of isolated studies had begun to erode the prevailing view, expressed most forcefully by Lewis Hartz in The Liberal Tradition in America, that John Locke's possessive individualism was virtually the only idea that mattered in 18th century or, indeed, all American political thought. But not until I began to immerse myself in the newspapers, pamphlets, and sermons of the Revolutionary era did I begin to appreciate how complicated the creation of American political and constitutional culture actually was. The radical character of the republicanism that the revolutionaries adopted in 1776, with its stress on corruption, luxury, virtue, and the public good, especially struck me as being at odds with the individualistic and rights-oriented liberalism that Hartz had claimed lay at the heart of American culture. Although I was aware of the importance of the communal values of republicanism to the revolutionary generation, and realized that Hartz had been wrong in his exclusive emphasis on American liberalism, I was still not at all prepared for the emergence of what Robert Shalhoub in 1972 labeled the Republican synthesis. My book was linked with Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution and with J.G.A. Pocock's Machiavellian Moment. For better or for worse, in the 1970s and 1980s, our three works were picked up and cited by an increasing number of scholars who had all sorts of interpretive needs and political agendas to promote. Not only did historians of 19th and 20th century America extend the Republican synthesis into their own periods of study, but other scholars, political scientists, sociologists, philosophers, and legal thinkers of all sorts, imaginatively exploited republicanism and Republican values for their own particular purposes. Indeed, the use and abuse of republicanism over the past several decades provides an object lesson in the power of politics to influence scholarship. Surely, much of the remarkable presence of the Republican synthesis in scholarly writings over the past several decades came from the peculiarities and frustrations of our contemporary politics. Since neo-progressive and neo-Marxist historians were traditionally suspicious of attributing importance to ideas, in 1969, one of them thought my book represented a dead end. They were initially hostile to republicanism and what they referred to as the ideological interpretation of the revolution. But with social histories turned to cultural history in the 1970s, the ideology of republicanism suddenly became respectable, even to leftist and neo-Marxist historians. Republicanism seemed to offer an acceptable communitarian alternative to the excessive emphasis on private interests and individual rights of liberal, capitalistic America that Hartz had described, an alternative, moreover, that, unlike Marxism, was an authentic part of America's heritage, indeed, central to its revolutionary beginnings. Suddenly, the left had something in the American political tradition to appeal to other than the rapacious, money-making justifications of liberal capitalism. Before long, many historians were appropriating republicanism in order to explain everything from working-class solidarity to ideas of motherhood, from the jurisprudence of John Marshall to the politics of the Jacksonians, from the anti-slavery crusade to Southern secession. "Having once been identified," declared Joyce Appleby in 1985, "Republicanism suddenly was found everywhere." And not just in historical accounts, but in political and legal theory as well. Law professors in particular used Republicanism's emphasis on an active civic life and common public purposes to deal with a host of legal problems created by liberalism's apparent obsession with procedural justice, neutrality, and individual rights at the expense of the community and its needs. Anyone seeking to understand the fascinating story of how law professors in the 1980s and 1990s enlisted republicanism on behalf of their legal agendas can find it, spelled out with great verve and clarity, in Laura Coleman's Strange Career of Legal Liberalism. If I were to write this book now, I might do it somewhat differently. I might add some material on religion and political economy, which critics have called for, and which subsequent scholars have more than amply supplied. But I would not change the book's central argument, and I could not make it shorter even if I wanted to. Although I have had requests over the years to turn out a popular abridged version, I have resisted the temptation. Anyhow, I would not know where to begin condensing the text. I have been consoled in my failure by Edward Countryman's too generous comment that the book could not have been one word shorter. If I wrote it now, one subject I probably would treat differently would be republicanism. Since republicanism has come to seem to many scholars to be a more distinct and palpable body of thought than it was in fact, perhaps it needs to be better set in its 18th century context. I certainly know more about the character of 18th century Republican thinking now than I did in the 1960s, and I have described that character in my more recent book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. Although monarchism and republicanism had different values, they were mingled in people's thinking, perhaps more than I implied in 1969. Classical republicanism was certainly not the besieged ideology of a few revolutionary intellectuals. It was not a body of thought exclusively identified with radical Whigs or Bolingbrokean Tories, with the extreme left or right, or with any fringe groups whatsoever in British and American politics. Republican values were not marginal. They spread everywhere in the culture of the Western world, not just among the English-speaking peoples, but on the continent as well. For most educated elites in the 18th century, monarchism and republicanism often blended and blurred to the point where the two at times seemed virtually indistinguishable. To be sure, few persons talked openly of deposing kings and instituting elective republican governments. Such seditious thought was not only dangerous, it was beside the point. People, even good aristocrats, could be loyal monarchists and still ardently promote republican values. Few of those aristocrats celebrating the humanistic and egalitarian values of Mozart's Marriage of Figaro in the 1780s believed that they were thereby undermining monarchy and their future existence. Monarchical and republican values thus existed side by side in the culture, and many loyal monarchists adopted what were in substance, if not in name, classical republican principles without realizing the long-term political implications of their actions. As the historian Franco Venturi pointed out, republicanism by the 18th century could no longer be reduced to a form of government. It had become a form of life, a set of ideals and beliefs entirely compatible with monarchy. Montesquieu and other enlightened thinkers praised the English Constitution precisely for its liberal mixture of monarchy with a republican spirit. Although they seldom mentioned the term, good monarchical subjects nonetheless celebrated republicanism for its morality, its freedom, its sense of friendship and civic duty, and its vision of society. Republicanism as a form of life was too pervasive and too much involved with being liberal and enlightened to be seen as subversive or as anti-monarchical. In essence, republicanism was the ideology of the Enlightenment. In the 18th century, To be enlightened was to be interested in antiquity, and to be interested in antiquity was to be interested in republicanism. Although the classical past could offer meaningful messages for monarchy, there is little doubt that most of what the ancient world had to say to the 18th century was latently and often manifestly republican. Like so many South Sea tribes for 20th century anthropologists, classical republican Rome became the major means for enlightened Britons to get some perspective on their society and criticize it. Thus, Dr. Samuel Johnson found that the best way to condemn the corruption of 18th century London was to imitate Juvenal's third satire on Nero's Rome. Most of the age's invocations of classical antiquity were covert and sometimes unwitting invocations of republicanism. As literary scholars have long been telling us, mid-18th century Britain did not much celebrate the imperial age of Augustus. After 1688, and especially after 1714, most Britons, even aristocrats close to the court, criticized Augustus and looked to the Roman Republic for values and inspiration. Cicero and Cato, not Augustus, were the Romans to be admired, and Tacitus's anti-Augustan republican view of Roman history was the one most read and cited. Augustus, whose very name became a code word for tyrant, was attacked as such by nearly everyone except royal absolutists. The Tories, thinking of George I, called Augustus a despot, but the court Whigs and defenders of the Hanoverian settlement, thinking of the Stuarts, did likewise. From 1688 on, the need for the government to defend the Whig settlement and to attack the Stuart pretensions to the crown meant that a quasi-republican, anti-royalist bias was necessarily built into the official center of English culture. During Walpole's era, court and country writers alike condemned Augustus as an imperial dictator, the murderer of Cicero, and the destroyer of the Republic. Everyone invoked republican values. Even the Tories, said David Hume, had been so long obliged to talk in the republican style that they had at length embraced the sentiments as well as the language of their adversaries. All these appeals to republican antiquity made anything other than a classical conception of government and governmental leadership difficult if not impossible to justify. Who dared speak against the politically correct republican values of independence and virtue? Older monarchical practices and privileges, of course, lingered on, but their traditional justifications were gradually eroded by new republican principles. Charges of corruption now came easily to people's lips, as the traditional assumptions that once had legitimated the exploitation of public office for private gain faded from memory. Republicanism did not overthrow monarchy from without, but transformed it from within. And it often did this by co-opting the values of monarchy itself. One of the most important historical discoveries that has taken place in the decades since I wrote my book has been the discovery of the importance of politeness to 18th century Anglo-American culture. Late 17th century Englishmen knew from their brief experience with republicanism that the severe public virtue of antiquity would never hold a modern commercial society together. Something else was needed, and that something came to be called politeness or civility. This politeness began as a central attribute of monarchical court life, but in the 18th century it was steadily popularized and republicanized to the point where it seemed to many to be crucial to social life in general. By the middle of the 18th century, at least in the English-speaking world, republican values, especially virtue, had become more closely identified with politeness and sociability. For many thinkers, republicanism offered new polite adhesives for holding people together in place of the older monarchical reliance on patriarchy, kinship, and patronage. People, it was said, ought to relate to one another in kinder, gentler ways, through affection, love, and friendship, which became the ubiquitous euphemism to describe almost every relationship, including even the most severe and unequal dependencies. To the most enlightened, Like Thomas Jefferson, sociability became the contemporary substitute for classical virtue. The antique virtue of self-sacrifice was now seen by some as too austere, too forbidding, too harsh for the civilized 18th century. People needed a virtue that demanded less in the way of service to the state and more in the way of getting along with others in the society. Unlike the classical virtue of the past, which was martial and masculine, this new virtue was soft and feminized and capable of being expressed by women as well as men. It was much more Addisonian than Spartan and much more social than political. Classical virtue had flowed from the citizen's participation in politics. Government had been the source of his civic consciousness and public spiritedness. But for many in the 18th century, virtue now flowed from the citizen's participation in society, not in government, which the most enlightened increasingly saw as the source of the evils of the world. Society, said Thomas Paine, is produced by our wants and government by our wickedness. The former promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections, the latter negatively by restraining our vices. The one encourages intercourse, the other creates distinctions. It was society, not politics, that bred the new domesticated virtue of politeness. Mingling in drawing rooms, clubs, coffee houses, and even counting houses, partaking of the innumerable interchanges of the daily comings and goings of modern life, including those of the marketplace, created affection, fellow-feeling, credit, and trust that bound people together in the natural harmony of the social world that was as marvelous to the 18th century as the discovery of the force of gravity in the physical world. As the ideology of the Enlightenment, this kind of modernized republicanism had to mean more than the restoration of a balanced constitution and the maintenance of a certain kind of disinterested political leadership and civic-minded political citizenship. In its origins, classical republicanism may have looked backward and scorned the making of money, and in this book I stress some of its anti-capitalistic impulses, but increasingly in its updated, more radical and liberal version, it became anything but nostalgic, pessimistic, and anti-commercial. Far from dreading modernity, republicanism helped to reconcile people to it. It prepared people, in other words, for the transition to what we call liberalism. Just as monarchy was transformed rather than supplanted by republicanism, so too was republicanism transformed rather than supplanted by liberalism, and, as Joyce Appleby has pointed out, it was being transformed even before the Revolution began. Although 18th century American republicanism still assumed a hierarchical society, a hierarchy, however, based on talent and led by a disinterested, leisured patriciate, it was never as severely or as thoroughly classical as perhaps I and others sometimes suggested. To picture the Republican Revolution of 1776 as something undertaken in a pervasive mood of anxiety over corruption and the loss of virtue misses all the optimism and exuberance of the period. Although many clergymen and secular leaders did see the Revolution as an opportunity for moral reformation, and I have described their hopes in my 3rd chapter, most ordinary Americans joined the revolutionary movement not out of fear of the future, but out of the desire to expand their rights and to pursue their happiness. At the outset of the Revolution, Americans saw nothing incompatible between republicanism and what they had referred to as the traditional rights and liberties of Englishmen. If anything, they saw the civic responsibilities and Republican participation of the people in government as the guarantor of their rights and liberties. Only later, in post-revolutionary America, when doubt arose over whether this Republican participation of the people in government, especially in their state legislatures, was the best guarantor of their rights and liberties, did an opposition between republicanism and what we have come to call Lockean liberalism arise. And even then, none of the historical participants had any sense of having to choose between two identifiable traditions, between Machiavelli and Locke. Jefferson could express simultaneously, and without any sense of inconsistency, the classical Republican fear of America's eventually becoming corrupt, and the modern liberal need to protect individual rights from government. It is important to remember that the box-like categories of republicanism and liberalism are essentially the inventions of us historians, and as such they are dangerous if heuristically necessary distortions of a very complicated past reality. I probably contributed my mite to this distortion of past reality and to the mistaken notion that one set of ideas simply replaced another en bloc by entitling a section of my final chapter, "The End of Classical Politics." I meant by that phrase less than has often been assumed. I intended only to say that after the debates and discoveries of 1787 to 88, most Americans, John Adams was a conspicuous exception, more or less ceased talking about politics in the way theorists since Aristotle had, as a maneuvering and mixing of three social entities or forms of government, and began talking about politics in recognizably modern ways, as a competition among interests or parties in the society for control of a quasi-autonomous state. But some readers have interpreted the phrase to mean that the entire Republican tradition came to end in 1787 to 88 and was abruptly replaced by something called liberalism. Cultural changes of that magnitude do not take place in such a neat and sudden manner. Republicanism was indeed gradually transformed into something we call liberalism, but in subtle and complicated ways that kept many Republican sentiments alive. As John Murren has pointed out, America developed a strikingly liberal society in the 19th century without creating a comprehensive liberal ideology to justify it. Instead, America retained its Republican conscience, in its obsession with corruption, for example, long after it had become, at least in the North, the most liberal, individualistic, and capitalistic society in the world. Certainly, the transformation from a Republican to a liberal or democratic culture was never a matter of people's accepting one block of ideas and rejecting another. That is not how cultural change occurs. Instead, people confronted particular problems, argued about them, and often presented new ways of dealing with them. In the process, they inadvertently transformed important strains in the classical Republican tradition. It was not that there were simply new kinds of people and new social groups emerging that required new values and new justifications for their behavior, though this was certainly true enough. It was also that circumstances often compelled those who wished to remain loyal to Republican values to challenge and to subvert those values. Take, for example, the issue of whether public officials should be paid salaries. The classical Republican tradition that went back to Aristotle and Cicero saw political office as an aristocratic obligation of those who had sufficient wealth, leisure, and talent to serve the Commonwealth. Gentlemen, as Jefferson said, ought to undertake political office in accord with the Roman principle without substantial remuneration. The founders were not modern politicians. They did not conceive of politics as a profession and office-holding as a career. Like Jefferson, they believed that, in a virtuous government, public offices are what they should be, burdens to those appointed to them, which it would be wrong to decline, though foreseen to bring with them intense labor and great private loss. Yet at the same time, many gentry did not have the wherewithal to live up to this aristocratic Republican ideal. Despite Washington's refusal of his salary as commander-in-chief, and Franklin's effort in the Constitutional Convention to abolish all salaries and fees for executive officers in the new federal government, most of the founders were in too straitened circumstances and too dependent on their salaries to serve in government without pay. Their concession on this point undermined much of the classical Republican conception of political leadership, at least in the North, and led eventually to the emergence of the modern salaried politician, to what the Tory Jonathan Boucher contemptuously called a new species of public men who pursue politics merely as a gainful occupation. In the same way, the classical Republican devotion to leisure among a gentry elite was transformed by circumstances. If public office holders simply worked for a living like everyone else, then the leisure that had enabled the aristocracy to justify its dominance of government in the Western world for 2 millennia lost its traditional meaning. In the northern states of America, work acquired a new dignity befitting an egalitarian, democratic society in which all adult males were now supposed to have occupations and work for a living. In the South, which retained an allegiance to traditional Republican principles longer than other parts of the country, this growing emphasis on work and equality made slavery an increasing anomaly and drove Southerners into believing that they were an ever more besieged minority. Complicated struggles and debates over particular problems like these, without any of the participants realizing they were defending republicanism or advancing liberalism, were what cumulatively transformed the culture. It is a mistake to argue about the transition from republicanism to liberalism in large abstract terms, as one paradigm replacing another. Such paradigms may be helpful in organizing the details of the past, but we historians need to be wary of their capacity to distort what actually happened. Only by appreciating the distinctiveness and complexity of the past will we be able to move beyond our ever more precious historiographical debates and actually advance our understanding of how we Americans came to be what we are. Gordon S. Wood, 1997. Preface. Joel Barlow, in his Advice to the Privileged Orders in the Several States of Europe, published in 1792, suggested that what really separated the free from the oppressed of the world was simply a habit of thinking. Indeed, said Barlow, the mind of man was the only foundation for any system of politics. Men never submitted to a king because he was stronger or wiser than they were, but because they believed him born to govern. And likewise, men have become free and equal when they have thought they were so. When men asserted that nature had established inequalities among themselves, and thus had given to some the right of governing others, what they actually meant, said Barlow, was cultural nature, not physical. Therefore Aristotle was as right in teaching that some were born to command and others to be commanded, as the French National Assembly was in declaring that men were born free and equal. What men believed, said Barlow, was what counted. Many astonishing effects are wrought in the world by the habit of thinking. It was custom, mental familiarity, culture, not force, that supported social gradations and distinctions, and even tyranny itself. But let the people have time to become thoroughly and soberly grounded in the doctrine of equality, and there is no danger of oppression either from government or from anarchy. In the final analysis, concluded Barlow, it was the Americans' habit of thinking that all men are equal in their rights, which had created their revolution and sustained their freedom. It was a profound insight, and one that I have attempted to exploit in this study of American political culture between 1776 and 1787. It was not, however, an insight with which I originally set out. I began simply with the intention of writing a monographic analysis of constitution-making in the Revolutionary era. Yet I soon found that I could make little or no sense of the various institutional or other devices written into the constitutions until I understood the assumptions from which the constitution makers acted. I needed, in other words, to steep myself in the political literature of the period to the point where the often unspoken premises of thought became clear and explicit. What I discovered was much more than I anticipated. My reading opened up an intellectual world I had scarcely known existed. Beneath the variety and idiosyncrasies of American opinion, there emerged a general pattern of beliefs about the social process, a set of common assumptions about history, society, and politics that connected and made significant seemingly discrete and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?